afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
We are here at the Scotts Valley Library with Larry Pearson. It is the 10th of October, 2019, and we're here to talk about the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Can you start by telling me how long you've lived in Santa Cruz?
I've lived in Santa Cruz County for 47 years.
Okay.
Long before the earthquake.
Had you experienced other earthquakes before?
Sure, I'm a native Californian, so I've felt lots of them.
Okay. So tell me your earthquake story. What were you doing before, during, and after the earthquake?
Okay, at the time of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, I was an associate planner with the city of Santa Cruz, and I was also the city's public information officer if and when we needed one. On October 17th at 5 o'clock, I left work at City Hall promptly at 5 o'clock to take care of some personal business. And at 5:04, I was in my car, stopped on a red light at the intersection of River Street and Highway 9. Immediately, having experienced other earthquakes, I knew this was a completely different animal. The car started to bounce like jumping beans, and the signals over the intersection were going back and forth 10 or 15 feet in the air. And I needed to return to City Hall as fast as I could. I was able to maneuver my automobile to do that, and already I could see a huge cloud over Pacific Avenue in downtown, and I knew it wasn't smoke. I knew it wasn't from a fire because it was basically instantaneous, and it was obvious that buildings had essentially exploded. So I got back to City Hall, and all the relevant city personnel went to we set up the Emergency Operations Center, which was in Fire Station number 2 on Soquel on the east side of town. That spot was chosen because it's not downtown in the floodplain. One of the catastrophes that could occur in Santa Cruz is a major flood, as did happen in 1955 here in Santa Cruz. So we set up there. And then in the days immediately following the earthquake, police, fire, public works personnel, we were all basically involved on Pacific Avenue, and the demolition had immediately proceeded. We ended up taking down 31 buildings. It was an extraordinary setting. We continued to have aftershocks of real significance. There were 2 or 3 5s, and it was a very dangerous place because more of the buildings could fall and crumble and whatever. Mm-hmm. So the city was, the merchants understandably wanted to get into their stores, retrieve merchandise as they could, or money, or see what the situation was. But we had to control access for public safety. You couldn't just have everybody in there willy-nilly, and access was a problem. Meantime, the heavy equipment was working, demolishing buildings, and these large semis with huge, it looked like a great big piece of pipe cut in half, these great U-shaped things the length of a semi-trailer, where the rubble would just be dumped. Mm-hmm. They were going in and out, taking away the destruction. Well, a lot of the business owners weren't too happy not being able to get in immediately or as they wished, but it was necessary to keep it from being dangerous and a problem. So several of them called up the county grand jury, and I don't know how many people know what grand juries do. They have many responsibilities, but one of them is to investigate citizen complaints against government agencies. Mm-hmm. So several of the merchants had contacted the Santa Cruz County Grand Jury and said, hey, we want to get in, what's the deal here, how come we can't? So I was called by the foreman of the grand jury, and he expressed the situation and wanted to know why, basically. And so I said, look, I think probably the best thing to do here is you get as many of the grand jury people as you can together and come over to City Hall. We'll give you hard hats and we'll walk a couple of blocks over to Pacific and you can observe the situation. And that's what they did. The next day we had 10 or 12 of them and we gave them hard hats and we walked over to Pacific. And on the way over, they were still asking questions like, gee, why is this necessary? And so we get there, it's like a war zone. The ground is shaking even though there's no earthquake. The big trucks and the heavy equipment and the demolition, and there's dust and just it's like a war zone, and it's just basically scary. And we were there, and it's noisy. You can't, we were there about 5 minutes, and I could see 2 or 3 of the grand jury members talking to the other in their ear so they could hear. And the foreman came over to me and said, let's go back to City Hall. I think we've seen enough here. Let's get out of here. Yeah. And on the way back, they were saying things like, well, now we understand why you have to do this. This is, terrible situation and inherently dangerous. And what we would do is, block by block, we would let merchants on one side of the street in for about 15 minutes, and then they'd have to withdraw, and then the people on the other side of the street would get their 15 minutes, and then we'd move up to the next block and repeat that process. So that was an interesting situation that illustrates there are a lot of things involved in the earthquake besides the physical damage itself. Of course, we were very fortunate. There were only 3 fatalities on Pacific Avenue. As people probably know, it was the first game of the World Series between the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's, which started at 5 o'clock, and so most people downtown, customers and patrons weren't there. They were at home watching the game, and many of the merchants had closed down to go home and watch the series between the Giants and the A's. So we were very fortunate about the timing, that it was at 5 o'clock and that this was a peculiar day that very few people were there. But it illustrates, particularly, government functions and what needs or should be done. So that was one of the primary experiences early on, and then I and others with roles were involved down there for 2 or 3 months, and subsequent to that became the beginnings of planning processes to determine how it should be rebuilt and what form that should take, and that was a whole other process for a year or so. One of the things that was really interesting to me, after about 7 or 8 days, I went up to San Francisco to the Marina District where the major damage had occurred in San Francisco, to talk to people up there to see how it was going and could we learn anything from their approach. And it was really interesting because down on Pacific immediately after the earthquake and for days afterwards, it had an absolutely unique and distinct smell. It's a smell that is basically the creation of 100-year-old dust and dirt and bricks crumbling and whatever. I drove up to San Francisco, I got into the marina and I opened the door of the car and there was the smell. It was exactly the same smell because they had old buildings and dust and whatever, and I've never smelled that aroma before or since. So it's absolutely characteristic when you have older structures. And the building codes in the United States, even as they evolved over time, were relatively primitive and non-prescriptive, but they got better and better. You could see damage downtown on 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. When you got to reinforced concrete buildings, there wasn't a whole lot of damage. It was the old brick, unreinforced masonry buildings that came down. And it's why earthquakes in the United States kill a handful of people, and earthquakes in Indonesia and other places kill 500,000. Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. So those were some of the interesting experiences, and it was as a person with a role, it was a once in a lifetime hesitate to use the word opportunity, but it was an interesting thing to be involved with by necessity, and we were very fortunate. I think in the county, as I say, we had 3 fatalities in the city. I think the county only had like 2 more. One person was killed in Watsonville driving their car, and a horse was freaked by the earthquake and ran across the road, and he hit the horse and died. So one of the things that perturbed us a little bit, us meaning City of Santa Cruz, and for that matter citizens of Santa Cruz County, a lot of the national coverage went to the marina in San Francisco, which subsequently had fire. We never really had any fires. And there was a section of the Golden Gate Bridge, the Bay Bridge that dropped. And there was the Cypress structure, freeway structure in Oakland, which was where the real fatalities were in that earthquake. I think 37 people or 39 people died when that thing collapsed. So most of the national coverage was on San Francisco because that's what people in the rest of the country know about. And it perturbed us because it was not a San Francisco earthquake, it was a Santa Cruz County earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake. So that's kind of a nutshell of it. There's more if you have any questions.
Yeah, so you talked about being the public information officer. What was that like for you to experience in the moment? Did you feel like you were prepared? Where did you get your information from? Who were you delivering the information to? Can you talk about that process a little more?
Sure. Good question. Given my function in this situation, we weren't at the time a large enough city where you need a public information officer. And that's why I was the guy that we went through a selection process, and I was designated, if we need that function, you're going to do it. And I said, okay, swell. So I did get some training. I went to a training session in Anaheim about earthquake response. I went to a training session in Coalinga. Coalinga had a pretty good earthquake in like '72, and they had sort of made a cottage industry out of earthquake seminars because there's a community college there. And so they would hold training sessions there connected with earthquakes. So I got to do both of those things before the earthquake struck. So I had some preparation and some training. And the way that the city of Santa Cruz chose to respond to emergencies, I think, was a really intelligent way to do it, and it worked very well. A lot of places have these great big manuals, thick binders, and they've got public works and fire and da-da-da-da-da, and there's a bunch of instructions and things, whatever. Well, when hell's going to hell, when things are going to hell in a handbasket, looking in the book isn't that great a deal. What we did is we had people designated for roles. Mm-hmm. The function of mechanically be in charge of what happens was the director of public works. I was a public information officer. Police and fire had their designated roles, and the fire chief and the police chief and lieutenants. People had been selected to perform certain functions when it happened, and we could have been a flood instead of an earthquake. So, and myself and others had some kind of training and or orientation for performing under those circumstances, and everybody did a pretty good job. There's so many unknowns. It could have been flood. No, it's an earthquake. Could have been a giant fire. Who knows what? Well, the manual is I think a fantasy in terms of being able to respond effectively to those circumstances. So I did have some training, and I'm glad I had some training beforehand. Yeah. There was one other example that is pretty vivid, and on the earthquake hit at 5:04. Buildings were falling down. Bookshop Santa Cruz and Lulu Carpenter's, the Bookshop Santa Cruz building fell into Lulu Carpenter's, and 2 of our fatalities were in that situation.
Coffee roasting company.
Pardon me, yeah, coffee roasting.
Yeah,
it was caused sort of by the wall of the Bookshop Santa Cruz, but It was in, yeah, a coffee roasting company. And it was known that there were probably a couple of people left in there. We got support from the outside pretty quickly. We got teams that are specialists in demolition situations and responding to crumbling buildings and stuff. We got building inspectors within 2 or 3 days to go up and down Pacific and do assessments on which buildings could be saved or could be demolished. It illustrates an interesting thing. We were a small place that got help from the outside, a lot of big help from the outside. When it happens in a big place, like on the Hayward Fault, or if it happens in San Francisco and Oakland and it's on a huge scale, it's going to be tough. We were the small place, we had our own response, but we got help from the outside. They're going to be big and huge, and there's no, we might send 2 people over there because we have some background, but it's going to be a whole different thing by virtue of scale. Anyway, there were, on the night of the quake, when the 2 people were probably in the roasting company, a lot of citizens showed up to hold a vigil. They knew and they told friends and whatever, so there were a lot of people around it, and we had temporary fences up, and one of these crews from outside that has experience in this, not our own city employees, but these specialized crews, they were in the building and they rigged up lights because power was off and now it's dark. And they're doing their best to look in the building and try and find any survivors. And we are getting aftershocks. There was a really big one pretty quickly. And it's very dangerous in that building for those people that are trying to deal with the situation. And they had to call a halt. They said, we have to pull our people out. We need better light. We can't see adequately. And the people, the citizens who were there, were not happy about the search and relief effort being halted for a while. And I had gone to that location. And by this time there were local TV stations in Santa Cruz doing coverage, and a person from one of the TV stations with their camera and their microphone said, well, what do you, that is the city, what do you think of, are you upset with these people who are, sort of protesting and whatever about the situation? I think the intent of the question was possibly to generate some kind of conflict or whatever. So my approach to it was, I said, no, we're not upset with the folks at all. We completely understand why they're upset, and they're concerned about these people, as are we. We're not happy that the search has been stopped temporarily, but we have to rely on these people, their expertise and what they know, and it's dangerous for them, and we're having the aftershocks, and when they feel it's possible and appropriate and safe to some degree, it's never going to be really safe to go back in, they will. But we're not any happier than the folks are that they had to stop it. And that took care of that. So that was another one.
You've talked about approaching the earthquake from your job position. What was it like on a personal level?
Well, as I say, born and raised in California, I've experienced, half a dozen earthquakes. Most of them are little funky dudes, and there were 2 or 3 of them that, hey, this is, something's happening here. Yeah. Nothing like Loma, Prieta, but so it wasn't alien to me at all. And we actually, the city, we actually knew if we ever had a really consequential earthquake on Pacific Avenue specifically, we were going to have bad situation because these old reinforced masonry buildings crumble. Most of the housing stock in Santa Cruz County is wood frame buildings, single story, a lot of them. Yeah, you break some windows and there's some damage, and some of them up in the mountains particularly hopped off their foundations and stuff. But basically, they don't come down, wood frame buildings. And so we also knew, I knew that okay, it's gonna be messy and a problem here. And then you don't really think about yourself. If you have an official responsibility. You just start doing your job, doing the responsibility. So between the fact that I'm lifetime Californian, felt earthquakes, knew what would happen on Pacific if we got one, because I've been a planner for years, and then my job is to do this as police and fire and public works were. So it was not traumatic for me in the slightest. And that also held for where I was when the earthquake hit. I'm in my car. Sure, it was weird. My car's bouncing up and down. I'm looking at these other cars like jumping beans, but it wasn't threatening, personally. You know, I mean, I knew no building was going to fall on me at the intersection of River Street and Highway 9, or Highway 1. So it was never traumatic for me personally. And as it happened, I lived in Aptos at that time, and my house had minor, inconsequential damage.
Do you think the earthquake impacted the Santa Cruz community?
Well, sure. I mean, again, no loss of life is a good thing, but we were, relative to what could have happened, we were very lucky. And, it changed the course of downtown. The Pacific Garden Mall had been developed under a lot of the leadership of Chuck Abbott, and it had been turned into a very viable central old downtown, which hasn't happened in a lot of places where the shopping centers, in our case 41st Avenue, happens and it kills downtown. Well, our downtown went to especially retail and entertainment and restaurants and was viable, but it changed that physical manifestation very significantly. It's still pretty darn nice, the planning process that resulted. We saved it as, all the buildings that were okay. There was no effort to, quote, sort of modernize and homogenize and make everything look the same. It was, and new buildings went up and they had individual character. So it changed that. One of the things that did happen on the positive side, we got recovery money from FEMA. And what that was used for was not individual properties, but one of the things that had happened is all the utilities in Pacific Avenue, sewer, water, electrical stuff, got trashed. And so they had to be replaced. And FEMA money basically paid for that. So one of the things that the community got out of the earthquake was we got all brand new infrastructure of utility stuff, and we got it paid for by FEMA money, which was legitimate and right. One of the things that was fascinating was when they did this, one section on Pacific, one block of Pacific Avenue, the main water line was a redwood box. It was over 100 years old. There were pipes, and then there was this one block that it was a redwood box, and then the next block is pipes. Public Works had no knowledge that this 100-year-plus old section of redwood box was still in Pacific Avenue and was carrying the main water supply downtown and was working. So that was an interesting discovery, but we got all of that new and paid for, and it'll be good for the next 100 years.
Yeah. Speaking of downtown renovations, things like that, a lot of people in this process talk about the Cooper House. Do you have any background knowledge of the Cooper House or how things played out with that?
Sure. Like everybody else, I was sad that the Cooper House could not be saved. Mm-hmm. As I said, we had several teams of building inspectors here from other communities and helping us assess all of the structures on Pacific, and as I say, demolition started within a day or day and a half. Yeah. Well, the Cooper House got whacked big time, although a lot, it wasn't knocked down and it still looked reasonable from various perspectives. But we had these teams of building inspectors, and several of them were involved in assessing the Cooper House. And the determination was that it would be nearly impossible to preserve it and recover it. It would be a huge expense, but even sort of putting that aside, just structurally it would be very tough. And one of the things that convinced me about the validity of that opinion was one of the building inspectors, and I was, you know, down and around there and talking to people and trying to get information. One of the building inspectors came out and said, "I'm not going back in there." Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So I think it was, I mean, everybody was upset and bent out of shape, and you know, people that didn't have as much information as, for example, I had. Yeah, well, when the guy walks out and says, "I'm not going back in," fair enough.
Do you take any precautions against natural disasters after your experience?
Myself personally?
Yeah.
No.
That's okay. No judgment here.
Well, I mean, you know, I got some extra water and flashlights and stuff, but, you know, I live in a wood frame building in Santa Cruz. It isn't going to fall down.
What's it like to reflect on your experience 30 years later?
Well, it's a long time now. And, you know, there was a 20-year, this is interesting to me, there's much more being made of the anniversary now at 30 years than there was at 20. There was a little ceremony downtown in front of the post office on the 20th anniversary, and that was about it. I mean, you know, there was some, obviously, news coverage 20 years ago today, but this is much more amplified. I mean, you know, there's several articles in the Good Times and schedules of who's doing what where, and that's how I came up here last week to hear Gary Griggs talk about, you know, catastrophes and the history of Santa Cruz County. So I find that interesting that there's sort of more interest now than there was 10 years ago at the 20th anniversary. But you know, viscerally, it's just a long time ago, and I was never freaked out anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
personally, I mean, you know, I wasn't threatened personally when it hit. My house wasn't knocked down. I had a roll to pay. So, I mean, it was very traumatic for a lot of people depending on their circumstances, but I was not one of them.
That's great.
Lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No, and I know you've talked to over 50 people so far, and there'll be more, and so you'll have I mean, this is a great project you're doing.
Thank you. And I appreciate you coming here and sharing your story with us. It's really invaluable.
Well,